The boy who came back from Vietnam in the spring of 1969 was not the same boy who had left in the winter of 1967. Everyone in the small Indiana town of Fairmont noticed it. His mother noticed it first. Daniel Hayward had been waiting at the bus station with a casserole in a covered dish and a small American flag in her hand. And when her son stepped off the Greyhound and walked toward her across the cracked asphalt of the Fairmont bus depot, she had to look at him twice before she was sure it was him. He was thinner. He was darker. His eyes had something behind them that had not been there before. He smiled when he saw her, but the smile did not reach the eyes. And Eleanor, who had been a mother for 21 years and who had spent her entire adult life learning to read the small signals of the people she loved, understood, in the moment of that incomplete smile, that something in her son had been damaged in a way that would not heal easily. His name was Daniel Hayward. He was 21 years old. He had been drafted in the fall of 1967, 2 months after his 19th birthday, and had served 14 months in the Central Highlands of Vietnam with the 1st Cavalry Division. He had survived. Not all of his friends had. He did not talk about the friends who had not survived. He did not talk about Vietnam at all. When his father, Earl Hayward, asked him over dinner on his second night home what it had been like over there, Daniel had set down his fork and looked at his father across the kitchen table and said, "Pop, I'd rather not." Earl had nodded and changed the subject and had not asked again. He was a Korean War veteran himself, and he understood. Some things you carried back with you, and some things you had to find a way to set down somewhere private. And the kitchen table on a Tuesday night was not the place for setting them down. Daniel moved back into his old bedroom in the small farmhouse on the edge of Fairmont. The farmhouse had been his grandfather's and then his father's, and now it was the place where Daniel slept and ate and tried in the slow, uncertain way that returning veterans had been trying for as long as there had been wars to figure out how to be a civilian again. He worked for his father on the farm during the day. The Hayward farm was small, about 90 acres, mostly corn and soybeans, with a few head of cattle and a barn that had been built in 1923 by Daniel's great-grandfather. The work was steady and the work was tiring, and the work let Daniel keep his hands busy, which was important, because when Daniel's hands were not busy, his mind would drift back to places he did not want it to drift to. He did not sleep well. Eleanor would hear him sometimes at 3 or 4 in the morning, getting up, walking quietly through the house, going outside. She did not know exactly where he went. She would hear the back door close, and then nothing for an hour or 2, and then the back door would open again, and Daniel would walk back to his room. She did not ask. She had been a mother long enough to know that some questions made things worse, and that the kindest thing she could do for her son right now was to let him have his nights without explanation. What Daniel was doing on those nights was walking out to the old barn at the back of the property. The barn was large, too large for the small farm operation the Haywards ran. It had been built when Daniel's great-grandfather had grand plans for the farm, plans that had never quite materialized, and as a result, the barn had always been larger than the farm needed. Half of it was used for hay storage and equipment. The other half had been, for as long as Daniel could remember, a kind of catch-all space, a place where his father stored things that nobody had decided what to do with yet, a place where old farming equipment was put away when newer equipment replaced it. a place where the slow archaeology of 3 generations of Haywards had accumulated in piles and stacks and forgotten corners. Daniel walked out to that barn in the middle of the night because the barn was quiet. The barn smelled like old hay and motor oil and the wood of beams that had been holding up the roof for almost 50 years. The barn was, in a way that nothing else in the world was for him at that moment, neutral. It was not Vietnam, and it was not the farmhouse where his parents were waiting for him to be the person he had been before. It was just a barn. It was just space and silence and the particular quality of an old wooden building at 3 in the morning when nothing was moving and nothing was happening, and a young man could sit on a bale of hay in the dark and try to figure out what to do with himself. He sat in the barn for hours sometimes. He did not always do anything. Some nights he just sat. Some nights he smoked the cigarettes he had picked up in Vietnam, Marlboros, because that was what they had been giving the soldiers, and the habit had stuck the way habits stick when they have been formed under duress. Some nights he thought about his friends who had not come home. Bobby Caldwell from Ohio, who had been killed in his 4th month. Donnie Reyes from Texas, who had been killed 2 weeks before Daniel rotated home. Charlie Birch from Pennsylvania, who had been killed in the same firefight where Donnie had died, and whose body had been recovered alongside Donnie's the next morning. Daniel sat in the barn and thought about Bobby and Donnie and Charlie and the others, and the thinking was not productive exactly, but it was necessary. He needed to do it somewhere. The barn was where he did it. One night in late June of 1969, about 10 weeks after Daniel had returned home, he found something in the barn. He had been moving around in the dark, trying to find a particular spot to sit, a corner he had not sat in before, because he had developed a habit of changing his sitting spot every few visits, the way a person who was not quite well develops small private rituals to give shape to time that otherwise has none. He moved an old tarp out of the way. Beneath the tarp, in the back corner of the barn, against the wall, sat a wooden crate. Daniel did not remember the crate. He stood in the dark and looked at it. He had been in this barn hundreds of times in his life. He had played in it as a child. He had helped his father store equipment in it as a teenager. He thought he knew every corner, but he did not remember this crate. He pulled the chain on the single overhead bulb that hung in that part of the barn. The bulb came on with a yellow, weak light. Daniel knelt down beside the crate. The crate was wooden, about 3 feet long, 2 feet wide, and 1.5 feet deep. The lid had been nailed shut. The wood was old enough to have darkened almost to black in places, old enough that the nails had begun to rust. Daniel could see, faintly, in the dim light, that something had been written on the side of the crate in faded paint. He looked closer. The paint had been black originally. It was now a brownish grey, the way old paint becomes when it has been sitting in a barn for many decades. Daniel could just barely make out the letters. The letters spelled out 3 words. The first word was Harley. The second word was Davidson. The third word was parts. Daniel stared at the crate. He did not move for a long time. He sat back on his heels and looked at the crate in the dim yellow light of the overhead bulb and felt something that he had not felt since he had come home from Vietnam. Something that was not exactly hope, because hope was a strong word, and Daniel did not believe in hope yet, but something adjacent to hope, something that whispered to him that maybe there was a thing here, a small specific thing
that he could focus on, that he could work with, that would let him do something with his hands besides farm work and let his mind go somewhere besides the Central Highlands. He stood up. He went to the workbench. He found a claw hammer. He came back to the crate. He pried open the lid. Inside the crate, packed in old straw and yellowed newspaper, were motorcycle parts. Daniel looked at them. He pulled out the first one, a chrome-plated cylinder head, slightly tarnished, but otherwise intact. He pulled out the second, a piston wrapped in oiled cloth, the cloth so old that it crumbled slightly when he unwrapped it. He pulled out a third, a fuel tank, unpainted, in primer grey, dented in one place but otherwise solid. He kept pulling things out. The crate was deep. There were more parts than he had expected. Many more. A frame, in pieces, but a complete frame. Wheels, tires that had gone to dry rot but were still recognizable. A transmission, a clutch assembly, cables, wires, brackets, nuts and bolts in small canvas bags, a toolkit. It was not a complete motorcycle. It was the makings of a motorcycle. Someone, at some point in the past, had been collecting these parts, planning to build something, and had stopped before they had finished. Daniel sat in the barn with the parts spread out around him on the floor and tried to figure out what he was looking at. The parts were old. He could see that immediately. Many of them had patina that suggested they were from the 1930s or 1940s. He recognized some of them. The cylinder head looked like a knucklehead, the kind of engine that Harley-Davidson had built from 1936 to 1947. He had not been a serious motorcycle person before Vietnam, but he had had friends who were, and he had absorbed enough knowledge through proximity to recognize the basic shape of what he was looking at. He sat in the barn for almost 2 hours that night, going through the parts. He counted them. He catalogued them. He laid them out in rough order, frame and major components in one area, smaller components in another, fasteners and small parts in a third. By the time he finally stood up and walked back to the farmhouse, the sky was starting to turn pink in the east. He went into the kitchen. His father was already up, drinking coffee at the table. Earl looked at his son. He saw the dust on Daniel's jeans and the look on his face that was not the look that Daniel had been wearing for the past 10 weeks. "You been up all night?" "Yeah, Pop." "Where were you?" "In the back barn." Earl nodded. He poured Daniel a cup of coffee. He pushed it across the table. "Sit down, son." Daniel sat down. He took a sip of the coffee. "Pop, there's a crate in the back barn, wooden crate, says Harley-Davidson parts on the side." Earl looked at him. He set down his own coffee cup. "There is. You knew about it?" "I did." "Where did it come from?" Earl was quiet for a moment. He looked at the kitchen window. The first light of dawn was coming through it, falling on the linoleum floor in a long, pale rectangle. "Your great-uncle Walter put that crate in the barn in 1947, Earl said. "Walter was your grandfather's younger brother. He'd been in the Pacific during the war, Marines, Iwo Jima, the works. He came back in 1946. He was..." Earl paused. He chose his words carefully. "He was about the way you've been since you came home, Daniel. About the same age. About the same condition." Daniel did not say anything. Walter had wanted to build a motorcycle since before the war. Always talked about it. He saved his money before he shipped out, and the day he came home, he started buying parts. He'd order them from catalogs, buy them off other guys who'd given up on their own projects, anywhere he could find them. He filled that crate over the course of about a year.
He had everything he needed. He was going to build himself a motorcycle and ride it across America. That was the plan. He told me that. The only time he ever talked to me about it. I was about 10 years old. He said he was going to build it and ride it and figure out how to be a regular person again. What happened? He never built it. He had problems. After the war, the kind of problems that men had after the war that nobody knew what to call back then. He drank too much. He couldn't sleep. He started to fall apart. By 1948, he was not in good shape. He stopped working on the motorcycle. He stopped coming around. He moved to Indianapolis and got a job at a factory, and we lost touch with him for about 10 years. Did he ever come back for the parts? No. He died in 1957. Hung himself in his apartment in Indianapolis. The family, my father, went up there to settle his affairs. Brought back a few of his things, asked us to keep the crate, said Walter had wanted to build the bike and had not been able to, and that maybe someday somebody else in the family would want to finish what Walter had started. Daniel sat at the kitchen table and processed what his father had just told him. His great-uncle Walter, whom he had never met, who had gone to war and come back damaged, who had bought motorcycle parts and never built the motorcycle, who had killed himself in an Indianapolis apartment in 1957 when Daniel had been 9 years old. The parts had been sitting in the back barn for 22 years. They had been waiting. "Pop," Daniel said, "I want to build it." Earl looked at his son. He looked at him for a long time. He looked at his thin face and his two old eyes and his hands that had been holding a rifle 6 months ago and that were now wrapped around a coffee cup in a small Indiana kitchen. "All right," Earl said. "That's all you're going to say?" "Daniel, Walter wanted to build that motorcycle so he could figure out how to be a regular person again. He didn't get to. Maybe you can. I'm not going to stand in the way of that. The parts are yours. The barn is yours. Whatever tools we have, whatever space you need, it's yours. Build the motorcycle. Take as long as you need. We'll work the farm around it." Daniel nodded. He drank the rest of his coffee. He did not say anything else. He stood up, washed his cup, and walked out the back door. He went back to the barn. The motorcycle took Daniel 6.5 years to build. He did not work on it constantly. He worked the farm during the days. He worked on the motorcycle in the evenings, on the weekends, on the long winter days when farm work was minimal, and the barn was the warmest place to be because Daniel had installed a small wood stove in the corner. He worked on it slowly. He did not have a deadline. He did not have a plan beyond finishing it. The first year he spent just understanding what he had. Walter's collection of parts was extensive, but incomplete. Daniel had to make decisions about what was missing, what could be salvaged, what would need to be sourced from elsewhere. He bought Harley-Davidson manuals and parts catalogs from used bookstores and motorcycle swap meets. He learned the language of motorcycle building the way a man learns a language, by total immersion, by reading and asking questions and making mistakes and correcting them. He made his first mistakes in 1969, and he was still occasionally making mistakes in 1975, but the mistakes got smaller and rarer over time, and by 1971 he knew more about pre-war Harley-Davidson knuckleheads than anyone in the state of Indiana who was not a professional restorer. He sourced the missing parts wherever he could find them. He drove to swap meets in Iowa and Ohio and Kentucky. He answered classified ads in motorcycle magazines. He bought a junk knucklehead from an old farmer in Wisconsin who had been using it as a planter. The engine was seized, the frame was cracked, but several smaller parts were salvageable. He bought a transmission from a man in Kansas City who had been collecting Harley parts in his garage for 40 years and who, when he learned that Daniel was a Vietnam veteran trying to finish a motorcycle his great-uncle had started after World War II, refused to take payment and gave Daniel the transmission for free. The motorcycle that Daniel was building was a 1947 Harley-Davidson FL Knucklehead. The Knucklehead engine, named for the distinctive knuckle-like rocker boxes on top of the cylinder heads, had been Harley's premier engine from 1936 to 1947. The 1947 model was the last year of the Knucklehead before Harley introduced the Panhead in 1948. It was a beautiful motorcycle. Walter had clearly known what he was doing when he had started collecting parts. The motorcycle was going to be, when finished, a museum piece, a final year Knucklehead, the end of an era. The work was good for Daniel. His father had been right. The motorcycle gave Daniel something to focus on that was not Vietnam. The work was technical. It required attention. It required the precise kind of patience that Daniel had developed in the army, but that he had not been able to apply to anything since coming home. He could spend an entire evening rebuilding a carburetor, completely absorbed in the work, his hands moving through the small, precise tasks of cleaning and adjusting and reassembling, and during those evenings the war was farther away than it was at any other time. The barn became Daniel's therapy. The motorcycle became, in some way that Daniel did not articulate to himself, but that his father saw clearly, the structure on which Daniel rebuilt himself. Daniel met Sarah Morrison in the fall of 1971. Sarah was the daughter of a farmer who lived about 5 miles from the Hayward place. She had been a year ahead of Daniel in high school, but had moved away to college and then to Chicago for a job, and she had only just moved back to Fairmont to take over her father's bookkeeping work after her father had had a stroke. They met at the Fairmont Diner. Sarah was 23, Daniel was 23 too. They had known each other distantly when they were younger, but they had not been close. Now, sitting across from each other in a booth at the diner, they discovered each other for the first time as adults. Sarah knew about the war. She did not push. She did not ask Daniel questions he did not want to answer. She simply was there, in the calm, patient way of a woman who had been raised by farmers and who understood that some men needed time to come back to themselves, and that the best thing a person could do was be present without demanding anything in return. They started dating in October of 1971. They were married in May of 1972. The wedding was small, about 30 people, in the Methodist Church in Fairmont. Daniel wore a suit. Sarah wore her mother's wedding dress, which had been hanging in a closet since 1944 and which still fit her perfectly. Daniel's father walked Sarah down the aisle because Sarah's father had not been able to attend due to the stroke. After the ceremony, Daniel and Sarah drove to a small lakeside cabin in northern Indiana for a 3-day honeymoon. When they came back, Sarah moved into the farmhouse with Daniel and his parents. Sarah understood the motorcycle from the beginning. She had been with Daniel for 6 months before she had ever asked about the project in the back barn. And when she finally did ask, Daniel had told her the whole story, about Walter, about the parts, about the war, about what the motorcycle meant to him. Sarah had listened without interrupting. When Daniel had finished, She had simply said, "Then you should finish it. Take as long as you need." She never complained about the time he spent on the motorcycle. She never suggested he should be doing other things. She brought him sandwiches to the barn sometimes, on long evenings. She sat on a stool and watched him work. She asked questions about the parts, about the engine, about how everything fit together. She was not a motorcycle person, but she became a person who understood her husband's relationship to the motorcycle. And that was enough. Mark Hayward was born in March of 1974. Daniel and Sarah's only child, a small, healthy boy with his mother's brown hair and his father's grey eyes. The baby's birth had a strange effect on the motorcycle project. Daniel was not able to work on it as much. Between the farm and the new baby and the small additional duties of being a father, the time he had for the barn was reduced to almost nothing. But the times when he did work on the motorcycle, in the months after Mark's birth, became more focused. Daniel had something to finish for. He wanted Mark to know, eventually, that his father had built a motorcycle. He wanted to be able to take Mark out to the barn when Mark was old enough and show him what his father had done with his own hands. He wanted there to be something physical and real that Mark could see and touch, a thing that said, "Your father came home from a war and built this with his hands and made something good." Daniel finished the motorcycle in October of 1975. Mark was 18 months old. The day the motorcycle was finished, Daniel did not announce it. He simply walked out to the barn one Saturday morning, did the final small adjustments, torquing a few bolts, double-checking the timing, filling the fuel tank with gasoline for the first time. Then he started the engine. The knucklehead came to life on the third kick. The deep, distinctive rumble of the V-twin filled the barn. Daniel sat on the motorcycle in the quiet morning and listened to the engine that he had built from parts his great-uncle had collected 3 decades earlier, and his eyes filled with tears, and he sat on the bike for a long time and let the engine run and let the tears come. After about 10 minutes, he shut the engine off. He walked to the farmhouse. He went into the kitchen. Sarah was making breakfast. Mark was in his high chair, eating cereal. "It's done," Daniel said. Sarah turned. She looked at her husband. She saw his wet eyes. "It's done. It's running." Sarah set down the spatula. She walked to her husband. She put her arms around him. "I knew you would finish it," she said. "I want to take Mark out to see it. I want him to see it the first day." "Yes." Daniel walked to the high chair. He picked up his 18-month-old son. He carried him across the yard to the barn. He went inside. The motorcycle was sitting in the center of the barn floor, complete, gleaming. The morning light from the open barn door falling across the chrome and the black paint Daniel had applied to the fuel tank and the fenders. Daniel held Mark in front of the motorcycle. "This is your daddy's motorcycle," Daniel said. "I built it. I built it from the parts that my great-uncle Walter started collecting after his war, and that I finished after my war. And someday, when you are old enough, I am going to teach you to ride it. And someday when I'm gone, this motorcycle is going to be yours." Mark looked at the motorcycle. He was 18 months old. He did not understand, but he reached out his small hand and touched the leather seat. He patted it. He giggled. Daniel held his son in front of the motorcycle for a long time that morning. The barn was quiet. The autumn sunlight came through the open door. Daniel stood with his son in his arms and looked at the bike that had taken him 6.5 years to build. The bike that had let him come back to himself after Vietnam. The bike that contained, in its frame and its engine and every chrome bolt, the work of his hands and the legacy of his great-uncle, and the slow, patient rebuilding of a young man who had come home from a war and had not been sure he could ever be a regular person again. He had become a regular person. The motorcycle had helped. So had Sarah. So had Mark. So had the farm and his father, and the slow, steady work of building a life, piece by piece. The way you build a motorcycle from a crate of parts. He kissed the top of Mark's head. "Welcome to the family, motorcycle," Daniel said. To the bike, to his son, to the empty barn, to his great-uncle Walter, who had died alone in an Indianapolis apartment 18 years earlier, and who had, in some quiet way, just been brought back into the family by the running of an engine he had never finished assembling. Daniel walked his son back to the farmhouse. He went back to his life. The motorcycle stayed in the barn. And there, although Daniel did not know it yet, and although Mark could not yet know it, the most important part of the story had not yet happened. It would not happen for 50 years, but it would happen. Sigo con la parte dos. The motorcycle that Daniel finished in October of 1975 became part of the rhythm of the Hayward family for the next 43 years. He did not ride it as much as he had planned to. That was the first surprise. Daniel had imagined during the years of building that he would ride the motorcycle constantly when it was finished. Long rides through the back roads of Indiana, weekend trips to Kentucky and Tennessee, maybe even the cross-country ride that his great-uncle Walter had dreamed of and never taken. But by the time the motorcycle was finished, Daniel was 27 years old and had a wife and a small son and a farm to run, and the long rides he had imagined turned out to be impractical for the life he was actually living. He rode the motorcycle on Saturday afternoons mostly. Short rides, 20 miles, 30 miles, occasionally 50, if Sarah was willing to watch Mark for a longer stretch. He rode through the rolling Indiana farmland, on the back roads that connected the small towns of central Indiana. Fairmont to Marion, Marion to Anderson, Anderson to Muncie. He developed a small loop, the way Frank Delano in Pennsylvania would later develop a loop with his own Harley, the way men of his generation had been developing loops for as long as they had been riding motorcycles. Daniel rode alone, mostly. He did not join a club. He did not go to rallies. He was friendly with the few other motorcycle owners in Fairmont, but he did not make a hobby of being a motorcycle person. The motorcycle was not a hobby for Daniel. It was something else. It was the thing his hands had built. It was the thing that connected him to Walter and to the war and to the long, slow project of becoming who he was now. It was deeply personal, and Daniel did not feel the need to share it. Sarah noticed that Daniel was different when he came back from rides. The strange Vietnam tension that lived inside her husband, that she had learned to recognize over the years of their marriage, the way the muscles in his neck would tighten when he was stressed, the way his sleep would become thin and disturbed when he was carrying something, would be lighter when he came back from a Saturday ride. Not gone, never gone, but lighter. The motorcycle was the only thing that lifted that weight from him, even temporarily, and Sarah came to understand that the rides were not recreation. The rides were medicine. Mark grew up around the motorcycle. He saw it every time he went out to the barn with his father, and as Mark got older, he went to the barn often, because Daniel taught his son to do farm work and farm repairs in that barn. and the motorcycle was always there, in its corner, gleaming under the bare overhead bulb. By the time Mark was 4, he was asking his father to start the motorcycle for him so he could hear the engine. By the time he was 6, he was sitting on the motorcycle while it was parked, gripping the handlebars, making engine sounds with his mouth. By the time he was 8, his father was letting him sit on the back of the motorcycle for short, slow rides up and down the long gravel driveway of the Hayward farm. Daniel taught Mark to ride a motorcycle on a small Honda 50, the same way most farm kids in central Indiana learned to ride in the 1980s, on small Japanese bikes that were cheap and reliable and easy to maintain. Mark got the Honda 50 for his 9th birthday. Daniel had bought it from a man in Marion whose son had outgrown it. Mark spent the next 3 years riding the Honda all over the farm, through the fields, around the barn, up and down the driveway, on the small dirt paths Daniel had cut through the woods at the back of the property. By the time he was 12, Mark had become an excellent rider. He had the natural balance and the natural feel that some kids have for motorcycles, the same gift that Tyler Mitchell would later have when Ray Tilden taught him to ride in a parking lot in another state in another decade. But Daniel did not let Mark ride the knucklehead. Not when he was 8, not when he was 12, not when he was 15. The knucklehead, Daniel said, was different. The knucklehead was too valuable, too old, too irreplaceable to be ridden by a kid who was still learning. The knucklehead would be Mark's someday, but not yet. Mark accepted this. He had been raised to accept his father's decisions about important things. He understood, even at 12, that the motorcycle in the barn was not a regular motorcycle. He had heard the story of his great-great-uncle Walter and the parts and the war in fragments over the years. His father did not tell the story often. His grandfather, Earl, told it sometimes when Daniel was not in the room. Earl had a way of explaining things to Mark that Daniel did not have, the gentle, deflective way that grandparents have of helping grandchildren understand things their parents could not yet say aloud. By the time Mark was a teenager, he understood the knucklehead the way you understand a sacred object in a family, something that was important, not because of what it was, but because of what it represented. The motorcycle was Daniel's coming home. The motorcycle was Walter's reaching across the years. The motorcycle was the proof that Daniel had survived something terrible and had built something beautiful out of the surviving. Mark left for college in 1992. He went to Purdue, 2 hours from Fairmont. He studied agricultural engineering. He came home most weekends during his first 2 years, partly because he missed Sarah's cooking, and partly because he had developed a relationship with a girl named Rebecca, who was a year behind him at Purdue, but who lived in Fairmont and who came home most weekends too. Mark and Rebecca had been friends in high school. They had become more than friends in the summer between Mark's freshman and sophomore years of college. They were married in 1996, 2 months after Mark's graduation. Mark and Rebecca did not stay in Fairmont. Mark got a job with John Deere as a field engineer, and the job took them first to Davenport, Iowa, and then to Minneapolis, and then eventually to a small town in central Illinois where John Deere had a major facility. They had 2 children, a daughter named Emma in 1998 and a son named Daniel after his grandfather in 2002. The grandchildren visited Indiana 3 or 4 times a year: Christmas, Thanksgiving, summer vacation, sometimes a long weekend in the spring or fall. Daniel and Sarah visited the grandchildren too. The long drive from Fairmont to Illinois had become routine by the early 2000s. Daniel kept riding the knucklehead through the 1990s and into the 2000s. The rides got shorter as he got older. By the time he was 60, in 2007, his Saturday rides were down to about 30 miles. By the time he was 70, in 2017, his rides were down to about 10 miles. His knees were not what they had been. His back was worse. The knucklehead was a heavy bike, over 600 pounds, and Daniel was getting too old to hold it up easily at stoplights or to handle it at low speeds. He started thinking about whether he should still be riding. He did not stop, not entirely, but he rode less. The motorcycle stayed in the barn more and more, on its kickstand, in the corner where it had been since 1975, with the small wood stove still in the other corner and the workbench against the wall and the crate of leftover parts. The parts Walter had collected that Daniel had not used, still sitting beside the workbench, untouched since 1975, because Daniel had never been able to bring himself to throw them away. Sarah died in March of 2014. Cancer. She had been diagnosed in November of 2013, and the disease had moved fast. Pancreatic cancer was always fast. By the end, she was in a hospital bed in their bedroom, with hospice nurses coming twice a day, with Daniel sleeping in a chair beside the bed, because he did not want her to be alone. She died on a Wednesday morning at 4:30 in the morning, with Daniel holding her hand. She was 66 years old. They had been married for 41 years. Daniel did not know how to be alive without Sarah. He had built a life with her. They had raised a son and watched him become a man and watched him have children of his own. They had run a farm. They had grown old together. The grief, when it came, was complete. Daniel did not eat for a week after the funeral. Mark and Rebecca came to Fairmont for 2 weeks to take care of him. Earl, Daniel's father, who was 92 years old and living in a small assisted living facility in Marion, came home for the funeral and stayed at the farmhouse for a month afterward to be with his son. Earl was the one who got Daniel back to the motorcycle. 3 weeks after Sarah's funeral, Earl walked into the kitchen one morning and found Daniel sitting at the table staring at his coffee. Earl sat down across from him. "Daniel." "Yeah, Pop. Go ride the motorcycle." "I don't want to." "I don't care what you want. Go ride it. Right now. I'll watch the farm. Take it out for an hour. Go ride." Daniel looked at his father. Earl was 92. Earl had been a widower himself for 14 years. Eleanor had died of a stroke in 2000, and Earl knew exactly what Daniel was going through. Earl had also been a Korean War veteran, and Earl knew, as well as anyone, what the motorcycle had done for Daniel over the decades. "All right, Pop." Daniel walked out to the barn. He started the knucklehead. He rode out the long gravel driveway and onto the country road and through the rolling Indiana farmland that he had been riding through for 45 years. The morning was cold, early April, the trees still bare, the fields still brown, but the sun was bright and the air was clean. Daniel rode for 2 hours. He rode farther than he had ridden in years. He cried for some of it, on the open road where nobody could see him, and the wind dried the tears as they came. He came back to the farmhouse in the early afternoon. He parked the knucklehead. He went into the kitchen. Earl was at the table. "Better?" Earl asked. "A little." "Good. Tomorrow you ride again." Daniel rode the knucklehead almost every day for the next 6 months. He rode it in the way his father had told him to ride it, as therapy as an outlet, as the slow, steady work of becoming a person who was alive without Sarah. By the fall of 2014, he had rebuilt himself enough to function. He was not happy. He would not be fully happy again, but he was a man, and he was alive, and he was, on the good days, even something close to grateful. Earl died in 2016 at the age of 94, peaceful death in his sleep at the assisted living facility in Marion. Daniel was alone now, really alone for the first time in his life. Sarah was gone. His parents were both gone. His son was in Illinois. The farmhouse was quiet. The barn was quiet. The motorcycle was in the barn. Daniel rode less in the years after Earl died. His knees were getting worse. By 2017, he was using a cane in the house. The doctor had told him he should not be riding anymore. The bike was too heavy. His reflexes were too slow. The risk was too high. Daniel did not entirely listen. He still rode, but his rides got shorter. By 2018, he was only riding to the end of his driveway and back, just to start the engine, just to feel the bike running for 10 or 15 minutes. He told himself he was going to give the bike to Mark soon. He kept saying that. He kept not doing it. There was a reason he kept not doing it. Daniel had a secret about the motorcycle, a secret he had been carrying for 50 years, a secret he had never told anyone. Not Sarah, not Mark, not Earl. The secret was the reason he had built the motorcycle the way he had built it. The secret was inside the motorcycle, in a small specific place that nobody but Daniel knew about. Daniel had decided, sometime in the 1980s, that he would tell Mark the secret eventually. He would explain everything. He would show his son the small specific place inside the motorcycle and tell him what was there and why. But Daniel had never told Mark. He had kept putting it off, year after year, decade after decade. He told himself there was time. He told himself he would tell Mark when Mark turned 50. That seemed like a good time. Then he had told himself he would tell Mark when Mark turned 60. Then he had told himself he would tell Mark when he, Daniel, was on his deathbed, in a hospital, with Mark beside him, and he would explain everything in the calm, clear way that fathers explain important things to sons who have come of age. Daniel did not get a deathbed. Daniel did not get the slow, clear conversation he had imagined. Daniel had a heart attack on the morning of June 14th, 2019. He was in his kitchen, drinking his second cup of coffee. The pain came fast, chest, left arm, jaw, and Daniel knew what it was within 10 seconds. He reached for the phone. He dialed 911. He told the dispatcher his address and the symptoms. He set the phone down on the kitchen counter. He sat down on the linoleum floor with his back against the cabinets. He waited. He did not last until the paramedics arrived. The heart attack was massive. Daniel Hayward died on his kitchen floor at 71 years of age, alone, with the dispatcher's voice still coming through the phone on the counter saying, "Sir, sir, are you still there?" And Daniel was no longer there. The dispatcher kept the line open. The ambulance arrived 9 minutes after the 911 call. The paramedics did everything they could. Daniel was pronounced dead at the scene at 7:48 in the morning. Mark got the call at his office in Illinois at about 8:30. He sat at his desk and held the phone and listened to the sheriff in Fairmont tell him that his father was dead. He thanked the sheriff. He hung up. He walked to the office of his boss, told him what had happened, told him he needed to leave immediately. His boss told him to go and to take whatever time he needed. Mark drove home, told Rebecca, packed a bag, and drove to Indiana that afternoon. Emma and Daniel, the grandchildren, both adults now, drove down from their respective lives the next day. The funeral was held that Saturday at the same Methodist church in Fairmont where Daniel and Sarah had been married 47 years earlier, and where Sarah had been buried 5 years earlier, and where Daniel was now going to be buried beside her. The funeral was small, about 40 people. Daniel had not been a man of wide social connections in his later years, but the people who came were the people who had mattered. Some old farmers from around Fairmont, a few of Sarah's old friends who had stayed in touch with Daniel after Sarah died, a handful of Vietnam veterans from the Marion VFW post, men who had not known Daniel well, but who had known him enough to come to a fellow veteran's funeral. Mark and Rebecca, Emma and Daniel, a few cousins from Earl's side of the family. Daniel was buried beside Sarah in the cemetery on the north side of Fairmont, the same cemetery where Earl was buried, where Eleanor was buried, where Daniel's grandparents were buried, the Hayward family plot slowly filling in over the generations. Mark stayed in Fairmont for 2 weeks after the funeral to handle the estate. The estate was simple: the farmhouse and the 90 acres of land, the old barn at the back of the property, the few things in the barn, the equipment, the workbench, the small wood stove, the old crate of leftover Harley-Davidson parts that Daniel had never thrown away, and the motorcycle, the 1947 knucklehead that Daniel had built between 1969 and 1975. Mark had inherited everything in his father's will, which was simple and direct, the way Daniel's wills had always been. The motorcycle was Mark's now. So was the farmhouse. So was the land. So was the barn. Mark and Rebecca did not need a farmhouse in central Indiana. They had a life in Illinois. The plan they had discussed between themselves on the long drive to Indiana was to sell the farmhouse and the land, and to keep only a few sentimental items from inside the house. The motorcycle was the obvious sentimental item. Mark had been planning for years to eventually take possession of the knucklehead and to display it in his garage in Illinois. Not to ride it, because he had not ridden a motorcycle since college, but to keep it as a tribute to his father. He did not get to that yet. The 2 weeks after the funeral were spent on the immediate practical work, meeting with the lawyer, going through Daniel's papers, figuring out the bank accounts, deciding what to do with the furniture and the household items. The motorcycle, in its corner of the back barn, was not addressed. Mark had told himself he would deal with the motorcycle on a return trip. He needed to get back to Illinois first. He needed to coordinate with a transport company. He needed to clear out a space in his garage in Illinois. He would come back in 2 months, in August, and properly take possession of the motorcycle then. That was the plan in June. In July, Mark received a phone call from a real estate agent in Fairmont who had been recommended by his lawyer. The real estate agent told Mark that there was significant interest in the property. Agricultural buyers who wanted the 90 acres for crop production. Mark accepted an offer in early August. Closing was scheduled for September 15th. Mark drove back to Indiana on September 8th, a week before closing, to take possession of the motorcycle and to do the final clean-out of anything sentimental that had been left in the farmhouse and the barn. Rebecca came with him. Emma and Daniel met them in Fairmont. They had wanted to be there for the final closing of the family farm. the last time the property would be in the family. The four of them spent that week in the empty farmhouse. They went through closets that had not been touched in years. They sorted through Daniel's papers and Sarah's old photo albums and the small accumulated possessions of two lives that had been lived almost entirely in this one house. They divided things between them. Emma took her grandmother's wedding china. Daniel, Mark's son, took his grandfather's old leather jacket, the one Daniel had worn on the motorcycle for 40 years. Rebecca took Sarah's collection of cookbooks, including the handwritten recipe cards that Sarah's mother had given her in 1972. Mark took a few small things: a photograph of Daniel on the day the motorcycle was finished, a small carved wooden box that had belonged to Daniel's grandfather, a few of Daniel's tools. On September 13th, 2 days before closing, Mark walked out to the back barn for the last time. He had been dreading this moment all week. He had been avoiding it. The barn was the place where his father had spent so many evenings of his life. The barn was the place where the motorcycle had lived. Walking into the barn meant facing the motorcycle for the first time since Daniel had died, and Mark had been putting it off because he knew that the motorcycle was going to break him. It broke him. He pulled open the barn door. The September afternoon light fell into the dim interior. Dust motes floated in the slanting light. The barn smelled the way it had always smelled: old hay, motor oil, the wood of beams that were now almost 100 years old. The old wood stove was still in its corner. The workbench was still against the wall. Daniel's tools were still hanging on the pegboard above the workbench, in the careful, organized way Daniel had always kept them. And in the back corner, on its kickstand, gleaming faintly in the dim light, sat the 1947 Harley-Davidson knucklehead that Daniel had built with his own hands. Mark stood in the doorway and looked at the motorcycle. He had seen it 1,000 times in his life. He had not seen it since his father had died. He stood in the barn and looked at the bike that contained, in its frame and its engine and every chrome bolt, his father's coming home from Vietnam, his great-great-uncle Walter's interrupted dream, the slow, patient work of a young man who had needed to build something to remember how to be a person. Mark walked across the barn. He sat down on a hay bale beside the motorcycle. He put his hand on the leather seat. The leather was warm from a slant of afternoon sunlight that was falling through a small window in the side of the barn. Mark sat with his hand on the seat for a long time. He did not cry, exactly. He sat. He breathed. He thought about his father. After about 20 minutes, he stood up. He started to walk around the motorcycle, looking at it the way he had not looked at it in years. He had not been close to the motorcycle in over a decade. He had not been to the farm regularly enough to spend time with it the way he had as a child. Now, at 45 years old, he was looking at the motorcycle as an adult, with adult eyes, with the eyes of a man whose father was now dead and who was about to take possession of the most important physical object his father had ever owned. He walked around the right side. He looked at the chrome pipes. He looked at the engine. He looked at the rear fender. He walked around the back. He looked at the leather saddlebags, small leather saddlebags Daniel had had custom made in 1976. Mark stopped. He looked at the saddlebags. The right side saddlebag had a small lock on it, a small brass padlock, the kind that took a key. Mark had seen this padlock all his life. He had asked his father about it once, when he was a teenager. Daniel had said, "Just keeps things organized,"
and had not said anything else. Mark had never thought about it again. But now, looking at the saddlebag in the dim light of the barn, the padlock seemed strange to him for the first time. Why would his father lock a saddlebag on a motorcycle that lived in a barn on a private farm? Who was Daniel locking the saddlebag against? There was nobody to lock it against. The barn was on Hayward property. The motorcycle never left the property anymore. The lock made no sense, unless there was something inside the saddlebag that Daniel had not wanted anyone to find. Mark walked back to the farmhouse. He went into his father's bedroom. He went to the dresser where his father had kept his small, valuable things. He opened the top drawer. He had been through this drawer once already, during the first week after the funeral, but he had not been looking for keys. He started looking now. In the back of the drawer, in a small leather pouch, he found 3 keys. One was the key to the farmhouse front door. One was the key to the barn. The third key was small and brass. The third key looked like it might fit a padlock. Mark walked back out to the barn. He walked to the motorcycle. He knelt down beside the right side saddlebag. He inserted the small brass key into the padlock. The key turned. The padlock clicked open. Mark removed the padlock. He unbuckled the leather strap. He lifted the saddlebag flap. Inside the saddlebag was a thick manila envelope, sealed with tape, brown with age. The envelope had been sitting in the saddlebag for a long time. The leather of the saddlebag had molded slightly to the shape of the envelope. The envelope had been in there for decades. Mark lifted the envelope out. He sat back on his heels. He held the envelope in his hands. He felt the weight of it. Paper, mostly, but with something else inside, something thicker, something that gave the envelope substance. On the front of the envelope, in his father's handwriting, faded but legible, was a single line of text. The text said, "For Mark, to read when I am gone. Dad." Mark sat in the dim barn with the manila envelope in his hands. The afternoon light was coming through the window. The motorcycle was on its kickstand beside him. His father was dead. His father had been dead for almost 3 months, and his father had left him an envelope, hidden in a saddlebag, on a motorcycle, sealed with tape and locked with a padlock, and waiting for 50 years to be found. Mark held the envelope and felt his hands shake. He understood, in the way you understand things sometimes without being told, that whatever was in the envelope was the reason his father had built the motorcycle. The motorcycle had been hiding something all along. His father had been hiding something all along. And now, with his father gone and the farm being sold and the motorcycle about to be moved to Illinois, the time had finally come for the secret to be revealed. Mark broke the seal on the envelope. He pulled out what was inside. Mark sat on the hay bale in the dim barn and opened the manila envelope. Inside were 3 things. The first was a letter, several pages, handwritten on yellowed lined notebook paper, his father's handwriting on every line. The pages were folded in thirds. They had been written, Mark could tell from the slight differences in ink color, over multiple sittings. Some pages were in blue ink, some in black. The paper had aged, but the writing was clear. The second was a small black and white photograph, about 3 inches by 4 inches. The photograph showed 3 young soldiers in jungle fatigues standing in front of a tent somewhere. They were all smiling. They had their arms around each other's shoulders. Mark recognized his father immediately, younger, thinner, but unmistakable, 21 years old. The other 2 soldiers Mark did not know.
The third was a small canvas pouch, soft from age, tied with a leather cord. Mark could feel something inside it, small, heavy, metallic. He set the pouch aside without opening it. He would open it later. He needed to read the letter first. He unfolded the letter. He took a breath. He started to read. Mark, if you are reading this, I am gone, and you have found the envelope I hid in the saddlebag 50 years ago. I'm sorry I am not telling you this story in person. I always meant to. I kept telling myself I would tell you when you were old enough, and then I kept telling myself you weren't old enough yet, and then I kept telling myself there would be a better time, and now you are 45 years old, and I'm writing this letter on a Sunday morning when you are visiting from Illinois, and I'm sitting in the barn while you and your mother are at church, and I'm realizing for the first time that I am probably never going to tell you in person. I am a coward about this. I have been a coward about this my whole life. The motorcycle has carried this secret for me, and I have let the motorcycle carry it because I could not figure out how to carry it myself. So I am writing it down. I am writing it down so that someday, when I am gone, you will know. The motorcycle in front of you was built from parts. You know that part of the story. Your great-great-uncle Walter started collecting the parts after World War II, and he did not finish, and the parts sat in this barn for 22 years, and I started building the motorcycle from those parts in 1969 when I came home from Vietnam. That part of the story is true, but it is not the whole story. What I never told you, Mark, is that some of the parts in this motorcycle did not come from Walter. Some of the parts came from me. I want to tell you about a place. The place was called Plei Trap Valley. It was in the central highlands of Vietnam. In February of 1969, my unit was sent into Plei Trap Valley as part of an operation called Operation Wayne Gray. The operation was supposed to clear NVA forces from the valley. The operation did not go well. We took heavy casualties. I lost a lot of friends in that valley. Many of them never came home. I'm writing this in the past tense, but I want you to understand that for me, Mark, Plei Trap Valley has not been in the past for 50 years. Plei Trap Valley has been with me every day. There is not a single day of my life since February of 1969 when I have not thought about that valley. That is what war does to a person. It does not stay in the past. It comes home with you, and it lives inside you, and it never leaves. 3 of the men I lost in that valley were my closest friends in the army. Their names were Bobby Caldwell from Ohio, Donnie Reyes from Texas, and Charlie Birch from Pennsylvania. We had been together since basic training at Fort Bragg in 1967. We had been inseparable. We had been through everything together. The training, the ship to Vietnam, the first months in country, the small adjustments and the big ones, the endless nights of being scared, the endless days of being tired, the slow process of becoming the men that wartime makes men become. We were brothers. We were closer than brothers. I have never had a friendship since the war that came close to what I had with Bobby and Donnie and Charlie. Bobby died in his 4th month, before Plei Trap. He was killed in a firefight near a village called Lai Kay. Donnie and Charlie died in Plei Trap Valley, in the same firefight 2 weeks before I rotated home. They were killed within 30 seconds of each other. I was about 10 yards away. I saw it happen. I was the one who carried Donnie's body to the medevac. Charlie was already dead by the time we could get to him. We brought them both back. We sent them home to their families. That is the part of the story I have never been able to talk about. That is the part of the story that has been inside me all these years. The thing I have not told you, Mark, the thing I have not told anyone, is that before Donnie and Charlie died, the four of us made a promise to each other. We made it one night in late January of 1969, sitting in a tent at our base camp, drinking warm beer that someone had managed to get hold of. We had been talking about home. We had been talking about what we were going to do when we got back. Bobby was already dead by then. He had died about 3 weeks earlier. But we still talked about him in the present tense, the way you do when you have lost someone and you cannot yet accept it fully. Donnie had a Harley-Davidson at home, a 1948 Panhead. He had bought it before he was drafted. It was sitting in his parents' garage in San Antonio, waiting for him. Donnie talked about that motorcycle constantly. He had pictures of it. He showed us the pictures. He told us how he was going to ride it across America when he got home. He was going to ride from San Antonio to Los Angeles, then up the Pacific Coast Highway to Seattle, then across the country back to Texas. He had been planning the trip for 2 years. That night in the tent, Donnie said something. He said, "When I get home, I am going to take that ride, and I am going to take all of you with me. Bobby, Daniel, Charlie. We are all going to take that ride together. I will get 4 motorcycles. We will all go. We will see America the way it is supposed to be seen, from the seat of a motorcycle with our brothers riding beside us." We laughed. We toasted with our warm beer. We agreed. The 4 of us made that promise in the tent that night. 2 weeks later, Donnie and Charlie were dead. I came home alone, Mark. I was the only one of the 4 of us who came back. The promise was broken because the people who had made it were no longer alive to keep it. When I came home, I was not okay. You know that. You have seen the man I have been your whole life. You have seen what the war did to me. I was a young man with 3 dead friends and a promise I could not keep. And for the first 6 months I was home, I did not know what to do with myself. I did not know how to be a person who had survived when other people had not. Then I found the crate, Walter's crate, the Harley-Davidson parts, and I started building the motorcycle. And here is what I want you to understand, Mark. The motorcycle I built was not just a motorcycle. The motorcycle I built was a way of keeping the promise. I could not take the cross-country ride with Bobby and Donnie and Charlie. They were dead. But I could build the motorcycle that we had talked about that night in the tent. I could build the motorcycle that Donnie had described. I could put my hands on a Harley-Davidson and I could finish the bike that Donnie would have finished if he had lived. The motorcycle was for them. The motorcycle was for the 4 of us. The motorcycle was the only way I knew how to keep a promise that the war had made impossible to keep. That is why the motorcycle was so important to me. That is why I spent 6.5 years building it. That is why I was so careful with every part. The motorcycle was a memorial. I did not tell anyone. I did not even tell your mother. I could not figure out how to explain it. The motorcycle was a private thing between me and 3 dead men in Vietnam. But the motorcycle is not just a memorial in spirit. The motorcycle is a memorial in fact, because some of the parts in this motorcycle, Mark, came from Bobby and Donnie and Charlie. Let me explain. When Donnie died, his parents in San Antonio sold his motorcycle, the 1948 Panhead. They could not bear to keep it. They sold it to a dealer in Texas about 3 months after Donnie's funeral. I found out about this in 1971 when I was already deep into building Walter's parts into a motorcycle. I had stayed in touch with Donnie's mother. We wrote letters back and forth for years, and she told me about the sale. She told me she regretted it. She said she wished she had kept the bike. I drove to Texas in the summer of 1971. I went to the dealer. The motorcycle was no longer there. It had been sold to another buyer about a year earlier. But the dealer had kept some of the original parts that he had replaced when he refurbished the bike for resale. The original carburetor, the original headlight, a few small fittings. They were sitting in a box in the back of his shop. I bought those parts. I told the dealer who I was and why I wanted them. He gave them to me for $50, about a tenth of what he could have asked for. He was a Korean War veteran. He understood. Those parts, the original carburetor and the original headlight from Donnie's 1948 Panhead, are in this motorcycle. The carburetor is the carburetor on this engine. The headlight is the headlight on this front fender. Every time the engine has run, the gasoline has flowed through Donnie's carburetor. Every time the headlight has shone, it has been Donnie's headlight. Then there was Charlie. Charlie was from a small town in Pennsylvania called Mount Carmel. His family did not have much. Charlie had not owned a motorcycle, but Charlie had owned a watch, a Hamilton wristwatch that his grandfather had given him on his 18th birthday. Charlie wore that watch every day in Vietnam. He was wearing it when he died. The watch was returned to his family with his other personal effects. Charlie's mother sent me a letter in 1972. I had stayed in touch with her too. She wrote that she wanted me to have something of Charlie's. She knew we had been close. She asked what I would like. I wrote back and asked for the watch. She sent it to me. The watch was not working. It had been damaged the day Charlie died, and the family had not been able to get it fixed. I took the watch to a watchmaker in Indianapolis. He looked at it. He could not repair it. The mechanism was too damaged, but he saved a few of the small internal parts, gears, springs, the second hand. He gave them to me in a small envelope. The internal parts of Charlie's watch are inside the speedometer of this motorcycle, Mark. I packed them into the speedometer housing in 1973 when I rebuilt it. They are sealed inside. You cannot see them, but they are there. Every time the speedometer has measured a mile, Charlie's watch has been measuring it with it. Then there was Bobby Caldwell from Ohio. Bobby's family had been the easiest to find. They lived in a town called Lima, only about 3 hours from Fairmont. I drove out to see them in 1974. I had never met them before. I had only known Bobby. I introduced myself as one of Bobby's army friends. I told them I had served with him in Vietnam. Bobby's family had a beautiful old toolbox that had been Bobby's. Bobby had been a mechanic before the army. He had loved tools. The toolbox was full of his hand tools, wrenches, screwdrivers, a small set of chrome socket tools. The family had not been able to look at the toolbox since Bobby had died. They asked me if I would like to take it. I took the toolbox. I have used Bobby's tools to work on this motorcycle ever since. The wrenches I have used to torque every bolt in this motorcycle came from Bobby's toolbox. I have not used my own tools on this bike. I have used Bobby's. Every time I have tightened a bolt or adjusted a fitting on this motorcycle, I have done it with Bobby's tools. That is the secret, Mark. The motorcycle is not just a motorcycle. The motorcycle is a memorial. Pieces of 3 dead men are inside it. Donnie's carburetor, Donnie's headlight, Charlie's watch parts in the speedometer. Bobby's tools have shaped every fastener. The motorcycle is the 4 of us. The 4 of us are the motorcycle. I have ridden the motorcycle for 43 years now. Every Saturday, every short loop through the Indiana farmland, every time I have ridden it for them. The motorcycle has been my way of keeping the promise we made in that tent in January of 1969. The cross-country ride that we promised each other never happened, but the motorcycle has been my way of taking that ride one slow Indiana mile at a time. Every mile I have ridden has been a mile of the ride that Bobby and Donnie and Charlie did not get to take. Mark, I am sorry I did not tell you any of this in person. I should have. I have been carrying this for 50 years, and I should have given you the chance to carry it with me while I was still alive. But I did not know how to talk about Vietnam, and I did not know how to talk about Bobby and Donnie and Charlie, and I did not know how to explain to you that the motorcycle in our barn was a graveyard with an engine. Now you know. The motorcycle is yours. I want you to keep it. I do not want you to sell it. I do not want you to put it in a museum. I want you to keep it in your garage in Illinois, and I want you to start it up every once in a while, and I want you to ride it sometimes if you can, even just down your driveway, even just to feel the engine running. Because when you ride it, 4 men are riding with you. Your father and 3 young men who died in a valley in Vietnam in 1969 and who never got to ride the motorcycles they had dreamed of riding. I have included a photograph in this envelope. The photograph is of me, Donnie, and Charlie at our base camp in late 1968, about 2 months before Donnie and Charlie were killed. We were all 20 or 21 years old. We were happy that day. The photograph was taken by Bobby 3 weeks before Bobby himself was killed. I have also included a small canvas pouch. The pouch contains 3 things. The first is Donnie's dog tag, one of his 2 tags, which I kept after he was killed because the army had given it to me when I helped carry his body to the medevac, and I had never been able to give it up. The second is Charlie's class ring, a small high school ring that his mother sent me along with the watch in 1972. The third is a small wooden carving that Bobby had carved during a slow week in early 1969. A little wooden bird, about an inch long, that he had given to me as a joke a few weeks before he died. I kept it in my pocket through the rest of my time in Vietnam. These 3 things have been in the saddlebag with this letter for 50 years. They belong to the men. I want you to decide what to do with them. You can keep them. You can give them to the families if you can find them. Donnie's mother passed away in 1995, and Charlie's family I lost touch with in the 1980s, but Bobby's daughter is probably still alive, and she would have been a small child when he died, and she might want the carving. You decide. I love you, Mark. I am proud of you. I am proud of the man you became, and the husband and father you became, and the life you have built. I have not always told you that as often as I should have. I have not been a man who is good with words about love. But I want you to know that you have been the best thing in my life. You and your mother. The 2 of you saved me. You both pulled me back from a place I could not have come back from alone. I am putting this envelope in the saddlebag now. I am locking the saddlebag. I am putting the key in my dresser drawer. Someday, after I am gone, you will find this. and on that day, you will know everything. The motorcycle is yours. I love you, son. Dad. Mark held the letter in his hands. He read it again. Then he read it a third time. Then he stopped reading and just sat in the dim barn with the letter in his lap and tried to absorb what his father had told him. He did not cry yet. He was past crying. He had moved into the place beyond crying that you go when something is too big for crying. A kind of stunned, silent recognition that the world you thought you understood has just been replaced by a world that is different in ways you have not yet measured. His father had built a memorial. His father had built, in the corner of this barn, a memorial for 3 dead Vietnam soldiers, and he had ridden the memorial for 43 years, and he had never told anyone. Not Sarah, not Earl, not Mark. He had ridden through the Indiana farmland with Donnie's carburetor and Donnie's headlight and Charlie's watch parts and Bobby's tools, and he had been carrying his 3 dead friends with him on every ride, every single Saturday afternoon for 43 years, and nobody had known. The motorcycle was 4 men, Daniel and Bobby and Donnie and Charlie. The motorcycle was a brotherhood that had been broken in 1969 and that Daniel had been holding together with his own hands for the rest of his life. Mark looked at the photograph. 3 young men, smiling, arms around each other, at a base camp in Vietnam in late 1968. His father, 20 years old, alive, smiling, with his 2 best friends who would be dead within months. Bobby was the photographer. He had taken the picture. Bobby was already dead by the time Daniel had received the photograph in the mail months later. The photograph was the last record of 3 of the 4 friends being alive at the same time. Mark untied the leather cord on the canvas pouch. He opened it. He emptied the contents onto his palm. A military dog tag, slightly tarnished, stamped with Reyes, Donald M., and the rest of Donnie's information. The metal was warm from sitting in a barn for 50 years. Mark closed his hand around it. He could feel the edges. He could feel where the stamping had pressed into the metal. He could feel Donnie, a high school class ring, a small ring, the kind that high school seniors used to buy in the 1960s. The ring said Mount Carmel High on one side and Birch on the other, and 1965 on the band. Charlie's ring. Charlie had been 17 when he had bought it. He had been killed at 21, 2 months before Donnie. A small wooden bird, hand-carved, about an inch long. The detail was rough. Bobby had not been a professional carver, but the bird was recognizable as a bird, with small carved wings and a small carved head. Bobby had whittled it during slow time at base camp in early 1969. He had given it to Daniel as a joke. Daniel had kept it in his pocket through the rest of his tour, and then he had kept it in a drawer for 50 years. And now Mark was holding it in his palm. Mark sat in the barn with the 3 small objects in his hand. The afternoon sunlight was moving slowly across the floor. Outside, somewhere, Mark could hear his son, Daniel, named for his grandfather, calling him, asking if he wanted lunch. Mark could not answer. He was not capable of answering. He was sitting in a barn holding the personal effects of 3 young men who had died in a valley in Vietnam 50 years ago. He was sitting beside a motorcycle that contained their fingerprints. He was sitting with a letter from his father that explained, finally, the secret that had defined his father's entire adult life. He sat in the barn for a long time. Eventually, he stood up. He put the small objects back in the canvas pouch. He folded the letter carefully. He put the photograph and the letter and the pouch back into the manila envelope. He closed the envelope. He walked out of the barn. He walked toward the farmhouse. His son was on the porch. His daughter was in the kitchen. His wife was in the living room. His family was waiting for him. He had something to tell them. Mark walked into the farmhouse with the manila envelope in his hand. His family was scattered through the small rooms. Rebecca was on the couch in the living room. Emma was in the kitchen wrapping dishes in newspaper for the move. Daniel was on the front porch on his phone. Mark stood in the doorway between the living room and the kitchen and held up the envelope. "Everyone," Mark said, "come in here. Now, please." The tone in his voice brought all three of them. Daniel came in from the porch. Emma came in from the kitchen, still holding a half-wrapped dish. Rebecca looked up from the couch. "What is it, honey?" Rebecca asked. Mark sat down in his father's old chair, the wingback chair beside the fireplace, the chair Daniel had sat in for 40 years, the chair nobody else in the family had ever sat in while Daniel was alive. Mark sat in it now because he needed to. He needed his father with him for what he was about to say. "I just found something," Mark said. "In the barn, in the saddlebag of the motorcycle. A letter from Dad. Dated, there's no date, but it was written sometime when I was visiting from Illinois. So sometime after I was 45. But before he died. So in the last 5 years. He wrote it for me. He hid it in the bag. He locked the bag with a padlock and put the key in his dresser. He never told anyone. He left it for me to find after he was gone." His family was silent. Rebecca set down her book. Emma set down the dish. Daniel sat down on the arm of the couch. "What does it say?" Rebecca asked. Mark held the envelope in his hands. He looked at his wife and his children. He thought about how to do this. He had read the letter privately. The letter had been written privately from a father to a son. But Mark could not carry this alone. He had not been built to carry this alone. He needed his family. "Listen," Mark said. "I'm going to read it to you. The whole thing. I think Dad would want you to hear it." Mark opened the envelope. He pulled out the pages. He started to read. He read the whole letter aloud. He read about Plei Trap Valley. He read about Bobby and Donnie and Charlie. He read about the promise in the tent. He read about Donnie's carburetor and Charlie's watch parts and Bobby's tools. He read about the motorcycle being a memorial. He read about the 4 men who had been riding through the Indiana farmland for 43 years, 3 of them ghosts, and 1 of them carrying the ghosts for as long as he could. His voice broke several times. He had to stop. He had to start again. Rebecca was crying within the first page. Emma was crying within the second. Daniel, 23-year-old Daniel, named for his grandfather, sat on the arm of the couch with his hand over his mouth and tears running silently down his face. When Mark finished reading, the room was quiet. Mark held the canvas pouch. He emptied it onto the coffee table, the dog tag, the class ring, the small wooden bird. The 3 objects sat on the table in the afternoon light. "This is what was inside," Mark said. Donnie's tag, Charlie's ring, Bobby's carving. His family stared at the objects. "Dad never told you any of this?" Daniel asked. "Never. Not one word. In 45 years, he never said a single word about any of it. He was carrying it alone. He was." The 4 of them sat in silence for a long time. The afternoon light moved across the room. Outside, a tractor was working in the field next door. The world continued, in the way the world always continues when something important has just happened in a small farmhouse on a property that was about to be sold. Eventually, Rebecca stood up. She walked over to her husband. She knelt beside the chair. She put her arms around him. Mark put his face against her shoulder. He cried for the first time since he had read the letter. He cried for his father. He cried for Bobby and Donnie and Charlie. He cried for the 50 years of silence that had finally ended on a Friday afternoon in September of 2019, when his father, dead 3 months, had finally broken his silence through a letter that had been waiting for 50 years. After a while, Mark stopped crying. He sat back. He looked at his family. "I want to do something," Mark said. "I don't know if it's possible, but I want to try." "What?" Rebecca asked. "I want to take the ride, the cross-country ride, the one Donnie was planning, the one the 4 of them promised each other in the tent. San Antonio to Los Angeles, Pacific Coast Highway to Seattle, across the country back to Texas, the ride that never happened. I want to take it on Dad's motorcycle. I want to keep the promise." The room went quiet again. "Mark," Rebecca said, "you haven't ridden a motorcycle in 25 years. "I know. And the bike is—" Dad said it was over 600 pounds, and it's a 1947 knucklehead. Those bikes they're not modern motorcycles. They're hard to ride. They break down." "I know. It's a long way. San Antonio to Los Angeles is 1,500 miles, then Pacific Coast Highway to Seattle, then back across the country. We're talking about 6,000 miles, 7,000, on a 78-year-old motorcycle." "I know. You're 45 years old. You have a job. You have a family." "I know all of it, Rebecca. I am not going to pretend that this is a sensible idea. But my father carried this for 50 years. 3 young men died in a valley in Vietnam, and they made a promise, and the promise was broken. And my father spent his entire adult life trying to keep the promise the only way he knew how, by riding 20 miles every Saturday on a bike he had built from their parts. He kept the promise as well as he could, but he didn't take the ride. None of them did, and I can. I am alive. I have a body that works. I have a motorcycle. I have time. Whatever it takes to take some time off work, I'll figure it out. But I am going to take this ride. The 4 of them are going to take this ride. Together. Finally." Rebecca looked at her husband. She looked at the dog tag on the coffee table. She looked at the class ring. She looked at the small wooden bird. She looked at the photograph of 3 young men with their arms around each other in 1968, 2 of whom had been dead for 50 years, and 1 of whom had died 3 months ago. She nodded slowly. "Okay," Rebecca said. "Okay? You take the ride. We will be here when you get back. But Mark, I am coming with you for the start, to San Antonio. I am going to be there when you start. So are the kids. We're going to send you off the way it deserves to be sent off." Mark looked at his wife. He had been married to her for 23 years. He had loved her for longer than that. He had never loved her more than he did in that moment. "Yes," Mark said. "Yes, please." The plan took 6 months to organize. Mark went back to Illinois. He kept the farmhouse and the motorcycle off the closing. He renegotiated with the buyer, paid a small fee to delay the closing on those specific items, and had the motorcycle transported to his garage in Illinois the following week. He spent the autumn and winter doing 2 things. The first was preparing the motorcycle for a long ride. The knucklehead had not been ridden hard in years. Mark hired a pre-war Harley specialist in Indianapolis, a man named Howard Vance, 65 years old, who had been restoring knuckleheads for 40 years, to go through the motorcycle from front to back. New tires, new cables, new brake pads, a complete rebuild of the carburetor, Donnie's carburetor, which was carefully preserved and reinstalled with new internal seals, a complete retune of the engine, a new battery, a new wiring harness. The motorcycle came back from Howard's shop in February of 2020 in better mechanical condition than it had been in for 30 years. The second thing Mark did was learn to ride the motorcycle. He took an MSF rider safety course in October. He bought a used Harley-Davidson Sportster as a practice bike, a smaller, lighter bike to relearn his motorcycle skills on. He rode the Sportster every weekend through the fall and winter, in all weather, building up his skills and his stamina. By February of 2020, he was riding 300 or 400 miles a week on the Sportster. He had developed, in his middle age, the riding skills he had let lapse when he had stopped riding in college. He was not as good as his father had been. He probably never would be, but he was good enough. The third thing, the thing Mark had not planned but that had emerged on its own, was the matter of the families. His father's letter had told him that Donnie's mother had passed away in 1995, but Donnie might still have other family. Charlie's family had been lost touch with in the 1980s, but they might be findable. Bobby's daughter was probably still alive. Bobby had been killed before Mark's father had even shipped to Vietnam. But Mark's father had mentioned in the letter that Bobby had been married with a small daughter when he died. Mark started looking. He had time in the months leading up to the ride. He used the internet, Ancestry, public records, Facebook, military records databases. He hired a small private investigator firm in Indianapolis to help track down what he could not find himself. By March of 2020, he had located all three families. Donnie Reyes's family in San Antonio still existed. His parents were both dead, but he had two younger brothers, Eduardo and Manuel, who were both alive and who lived in San Antonio. They were in their late 60s now. Eduardo was a retired schoolteacher. Manuel was a retired postal worker. They had been small children when Donnie had died, but they remembered him. They remembered his motorcycle. They remembered his promise to take them on a ride when they were old enough. They remembered the day the army had come to their parents' door with the news. Charlie Birch's family in Mount Carmel, Pennsylvania, had moved away in the 1980s. But Mark tracked down Charlie's younger sister, Diane, who had been 15 when Charlie had died. Diane was 65 now and lived in Phoenix, Arizona. She remembered her brother vividly. She had been the closest member of his family to him. Bobby Caldwell's daughter, Rebecca, same name as Mark's wife, by coincidence, had been 3 years old when Bobby had died. She was now 54 and lived in Cincinnati, Ohio. She had grown up without a father. Her mother had remarried in 1974 to a kind man who had raised her. But Rebecca had always been curious about her biological father. She had collected, over the years, every small artifact she could find. Letters Bobby had written from Vietnam, photographs from his unit, his Purple Heart, his folded American flag. She had never met any of his army friends. Mark called all three families. He told them who he was. He told them about the letter. He told them about the motorcycle. He told them what he was planning to do. All three families wept on the phone. All three families wanted to be involved. The plan grew. What had started as Mark taking a solo cross-country ride on his father's motorcycle became something larger. Mark would start in San Antonio at the Reyes family home. Eduardo and Manuel would be there. The motorcycle would be parked in front of their house. The same house where Donnie had lived as a teenager. The same house where Donnie's 1948 Panhead had once been parked. The house that the Reyes family still owned. Mark would receive a blessing from Donnie's brothers before starting the ride. Donnie's dog tag would be in Mark's pocket. Mark would ride west to Phoenix. Diane Birch would meet him there. He would spend a day with her. She would put Charlie's class ring on a chain around her neck and wear it during their visit. Then Mark would continue on toward Los Angeles. After the Pacific Coast Highway ride to Seattle, Mark would turn east. He would ride through Idaho, Montana, the Dakotas, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and then south to Cincinnati. Bobby's daughter Rebecca would meet him there. He would deliver Bobby's small wooden bird carving to her in person. Then he would ride home to Illinois. The total trip was projected at about 7,200 miles. Mark estimated it would take him 6 weeks. He took a leave of absence from John Deere. The company, when he explained why, gave him 3 months of unpaid leave. They did not have to, but the regional manager had read about Mark's father in a small piece a local Indiana newspaper had run when they had heard about the planned ride, and the regional manager had called Mark personally and told him to take whatever time he needed. The ride was originally scheduled for May of 2020. The pandemic delayed it. Mark waited. The ride was rescheduled for August of 2020, then for the spring of 2021. The whole project sat in suspension for almost a year. Mark used the time to keep working on the motorcycle, to keep training his riding skills, to keep building relationships with the 3 families by phone and email, and the occasional careful socially distanced visit. The ride finally began on May 8, 2021. Mark left San Antonio on a hot Saturday morning. The motorcycle was parked in front of the small white stucco house on the south side of San Antonio, where the Reyes brothers had grown up. Eduardo and Manuel were on the porch. They were Banat old men now, in their late 60s, with white hair and weathered faces. Their wives stood beside them. Their grandchildren, Donnie's great-nieces and great-nephews, stood in the yard. The neighborhood was quiet. The Texas sun was already hot at 9 in the morning. Mark stood beside the motorcycle. He was wearing a black leather jacket, one he had bought specifically for the ride. He had Donnie's dog tag in his shirt pocket. Charlie's ring was in his saddlebag in a small velvet pouch. The wooden bird carving was in another pouch beside the ring. Eduardo Reyes walked down the steps of the porch. He stood in front of Mark. He held a small wooden cross about 3 inches long that his mother had carved by hand the year after Donnie had died. The cross had been on Donnie's grave for a few weeks, and then the family had brought it inside the house and kept it on the mantel ever since. Mark, Eduardo said. He spoke with the soft Texas accent of a man who had been born and raised in San Antonio. My family wants to give you this. It was made by my mother for my brother. My mother is dead, like my brother. But my mother would have wanted my brother to ride with you, and she would have wanted this cross to ride with him. We would like you to carry it, take it across the country, bring it back to us when you finish. Mark took the cross. He held it carefully in his palm. He felt the rough handmade carving. He thought about a Mexican-American mother in San Antonio in 1969, sitting at her kitchen table with a small piece of pine and a knife, carving a cross for the grave of a son who had been killed in a valley she had never heard of, in a war she did not understand,
fighting for a country that had drafted him out of her home and sent him to die. Thank you, Eduardo. I will carry it. I will bring it back. Manuel walked down the steps. He carried something else, a small key on a leather thong. The key was small and worn. This key was for Donnie's motorcycle, Manuel said. The 1948 Panhead. The bike was sold years ago, but my parents kept the key. It was the only piece of the bike they could not let go of. We would like you to put it on your father's motorcycle. Hang it from the handlebars. Let it ride with you. The key has not been on a motorcycle in 50 years. It is time. Mark took the key. He walked to the motorcycle. He looped the leather thong around the right handlebar grip. The small key dangled there, tarnished, ready to ride for the first time since 1969. He walked back to the brothers. He hugged them both. The Reyes family stood in the yard and watched. Take care of our brother, Eduardo said. Take him on the ride. Bring him home. I will. Mark put on his helmet. He swung his leg over the motorcycle. He started the engine. The knucklehead roared to life. The deep, distinctive sound of the V-twin filled the small San Antonio neighborhood. Donnie's carburetor, rebuilt by Howard Vance, but still the same carburetor that had been in Donnie's motorcycle in San Antonio in 1968, fed gasoline to an engine that had been built by a young man in Indiana from parts that had been collected by an older man in 1947. Eduardo Reyes saluted. Manuel Reyes saluted. The grandchildren waved. Mark pulled away from the curb. He rode out of the neighborhood. He rode west on the highway, toward Texas, toward New Mexico, toward Arizona, toward the long ride that was finally beginning, 52 years after a promise had been made in a tent in the central highlands of Vietnam. The ride took 47 days. Mark visited Diane Birch in Phoenix on day 5. She had set up a small ceremony in her backyard. She invited her husband, her 2 adult children, and her 4 grandchildren. She put on Charlie's class ring on a chain around her neck. She kept it there for the entire day Mark was visiting. They had dinner together. They looked at old photographs of Charlie. Diane told Mark stories about her brother, about Charlie as a boy in Mount Carmel, about Charlie in high school, about the day Charlie had been drafted, about the last letter she had received from him. The stories were small and quiet and important. Mark recorded them on his phone with Diane's permission. He would later transcribe them and send them to Charlie's other relatives that he had been able to track down, distant cousins, a niece, a nephew, so that the stories of Charlie Birch would not be lost. The Pacific Coast Highway was beautiful. Mark rode it slowly. The knucklehead was not built for fast riding, and Mark was not in a hurry. He stopped often. He took pictures. He stayed in small motels, in small coastal towns. He met other motorcycle riders along the way, most of them on modern bikes, who were fascinated by the 74-year-old knucklehead and who wanted to hear the story. Mark told the story. He told it again and again, at every stop, to every rider who asked. The story spread. By the time Mark reached Seattle, 2 weeks into the ride, there was a small Facebook group dedicated to tracking his progress, started by a motorcycle blogger in California who had met Mark at a gas station in Big Sur. Mark turned east. He rode through Washington, Idaho, Montana. The knucklehead held up. There were small mechanical issues, a leaking gasket near Bozeman, a fuel filter that needed replacing in North Dakota, but nothing serious. Mark fixed the small issues himself, using Bobby's tools, the same tools his father had used for 43 years.
He reached Cincinnati on day 42. Bobby Caldwell's daughter, Rebecca, was waiting for him at her house. She was 54 years old. She had her father's eyes. Mark could see it in the photographs. She lived in a comfortable suburban house with her husband, Jim. She had 2 adult sons. When Mark arrived, Rebecca came down the front walk to meet him. She walked slowly, her eyes already wet. Mark dismounted. He removed his helmet. He pulled the small canvas pouch from his saddlebag. He took out the small wooden bird carving. He held it out to her. "Rebecca," Mark said, "this was your father's. He carved it himself. He gave it to my father a few weeks before he died, as a joke, just a small thing he had whittled. My father kept it for 50 years. He wanted you to have it." Rebecca took the small wooden bird. She held it in her hand. She had grown up knowing that her father had been a man who could work with his hands, a mechanic before the war. But she had never held anything he had made. The wooden bird was the first object her father had touched that she had ever held. She started to cry. Mark held her. They stood in the front yard of her house in Cincinnati, with the knucklehead parked at the curb, with the deep summer afternoon around them, with a small wooden bird in a 54-year-old woman's palm, and they stood there for a long time. "He was 22 when he died," Rebecca said. "I was 3. I don't have a single memory of him." "I know. Tell me what your father said about him." So Mark sat with her on her porch and told her everything his father had told him, and everything else he had been able to learn about Bobby Caldwell from the men who had served with him in the months before Vietnam. He stayed in Cincinnati for 2 days. Rebecca's husband Jim made him steaks and beer. Rebecca's sons came over with their families. The grandchildren of Bobby Caldwell, small kids who had never known their grandfather, sat on Mark's lap and asked him about the motorcycle. And Mark told them about their great-grandfather and the war and the wooden bird. Rebecca walked Mark out to the motorcycle on the morning he left. She stood by the bike. She had the wooden bird in a small wooden box now, carefully wrapped in cotton. "Thank you, Mark. You're welcome. Would you do something for me when you get home? Send me a small piece of the motorcycle. Anything. A nut. A bolt. Something that has been part of the bike. I want to have a small piece of the motorcycle that my father's hands worked on." Bobby's hands didn't work on the motorcycle, Rebecca. The motorcycle was built after he died. His tools did. His tools shaped the motorcycle. Send me a bolt that was tightened with one of his wrenches. That's enough. That will be a piece of him too. Mark nodded. "I'll send you something." He rode away. He rode the last leg home. He arrived in Illinois on June 23, 2021, 47 days after he had left San Antonio, 7,300 miles. The knucklehead had held up. Mark had held up. Donnie's dog tag had been in his pocket the entire ride. Donnie's carburetor had fed gasoline to the engine for every mile. Donnie's mother's wooden cross had been zip-tied to the motorcycle's frame, hidden but present. Donnie's brother Manuel's leather-thonged key had hung from the right handlebar for every mile. Charlie's watch parts had been inside the speedometer, measuring miles for the first time in 50 years. Bobby's tools had ridden in the saddlebag, ready to fix anything that needed fixing. The wooden bird had ridden with him until Cincinnati. The class ring had been mailed from Phoenix to Mark's house and was waiting on his kitchen table when he came home, returned by Diane after she had worn it for 45 days, the way she had agreed she would when Mark visited her. The four men had taken their ride. The promise was kept. Mark returned the motorcycle to its place, now in his garage in Illinois. He sent a small bolt and washer to Rebecca Caldwell in Cincinnati in a small velvet box, and she put it on her mantel beside the wooden bird. He returned the wooden cross to Eduardo and Manuel Reyes in San Antonio. They put it back on the family mantel, where it had sat for 52 years, except now it had been on a cross-country ride, and it had ridden with the brother they had lost, and it had returned home with the dust of 7,000 miles still in its grain. Mark wrote a long letter to his father, a letter to a dead man, knowing it would never be read, describing the entire ride. He sealed the letter in an envelope. He drove to Fairmont, to the cemetery on the north side of town, and he placed the letter on his father's grave, beside Sarah's grave, beside the empty space where Daniel and Sarah's grandparents and parents had been buried. He left the letter there. He did not know what would happen to it. Rain, eventually. Wind. The slow disappearance of paper into the elements. He did not care. The letter was for his father. The act of writing it and leaving it had been for him. The motorcycle sits in Mark's garage now. He starts it once a week. He rides it occasionally. Short rides around the small town in Illinois where he lives, with the same slow, careful attention his father had ridden it for 43 years. The motorcycle is 78 years old now. It is still running. It will probably still be running long after Mark is gone. Mark's son, Daniel, named for his grandfather, 25 years old now, has begun to take an interest in the motorcycle. He asks his father to teach him to ride. He sits on the motorcycle and grips the handlebars. He listens to the engine. He has heard the story. He knows what is inside the motorcycle. He understands what the motorcycle is. The motorcycle has been promised to him. When Daniel is 45 years old, the motorcycle will be his. The story will pass to him. He will carry it for the next generation. And someday, if there is another grandchild, the story will pass again. The four men who started the story in a tent in Vietnam in January of 1969 are part of the family now. They are not just Daniel Hayward's friends. They are Bobby and Donnie and Charlie. They belong to the Hayward family. They belong to the motorcycle. They will belong to it for as long as the motorcycle keeps running. And the motorcycle will keep running for as long as someone in the family is alive to start its engine. That is the story of a Vietnam veteran who came home in 1969 and built a Harley-Davidson from spare parts. That is the story of three young men who died in a valley and who came home anyway, in fragments, carried by their friend in the most beautiful machine he could build. Some promises are kept slowly. Some promises are kept across decades. Some promises are kept by sons after fathers can no longer keep them. But promises that are made by good men are eventually kept. That is the lesson. The motorcycle is still running. The promise is still being kept. The four of them are still riding.